All right. Well, thank you all so much for having me out today. I appreciate it. And again, as John mentioned, I am from Texas, so I will take credit for the warm weather that I brought you today. So I hope you enjoy. Unfortunately, I think when I leave tomorrow, I'm taking it back with me. Um, but it's been nice and warm down in Texas. I've been with Jones Hamilton for a little over a year. And before that, of course, I was in academia and did a lot of litter research for the last 20 years or so. And so I've kind of continued that line of work with Jones Hamilton. So today I want to share a lot of information with you guys about litter management and really try to give you some more scientific uh, ideas behind what it is we do with litter management. All of us have been taught for a long time, right, that to grow good chickens, we got to make sure we prioritize, right? And those three priorities are feed, air, and water, right? And I won't disagree with that, right? If we don't have feed, air, and water to the chickens, then they're not going to live, they're not going to grow. So those are our top three priorities. But I would like to submit to you that litter should be number 4 on that list, right? It should right behind feed, air, and water. If you go in the chicken house and the air is good, they have water, the feed lines are running like they should be, everything is good. The next thing we should really be thinking about is the litter. And the reason I say that is because the birds sit on it, they walk on it, they sleep on it, they eat it. Chickens aren't very smart, right? They instinctively peck at the ground. And you can kill a chicken and open the gizzard up, and you can always find litter in the gizzard, right? They're going to eat it, and they're going to breathe it. The dust, the gases, whatever's coming off that litter, they're going to be breathing that. So really, litter is so important to the health of our birds. It really needs to be at the top of our mind if we're going to grow a good chicken. And sometimes, unfortunately, I refer to litter as the necessary evil, right? I wish we could get rid of litter. I wish we didn't have litter. I did research for years trying to figure out how can we grow chickens without litter, right? I know there was research here on the shore where they tried things like plastic floors and things, right, to try to get rid of litter because it is such a problem for us. Unfortunately, no one's come up with a good solution yet, so it is the necessary evil that we have to have and I say evil because of all the problems that emanate from the litter, right? We have ammonia, dust, odors, humidity, bacteria, parasites, all kind of things that basically try to kill our chickens, right? And so we really got to try to focus on that litter if we're going to be successful. All right, so a lot of people will say, well, we're ready to put down the birds. The litter looks great. I don't care really what the litter looks like, right? It could look beautiful and it could be absolutely horrible from a microbiological standpoint and a water absorption standpoint. It could be the worst litter ever, but look beautiful. Okay, so it's not about looks. Yeah, it should be level. It should not have big clumps and it should be dry. I mean, yeah, I agree with those things, but don't judge the quality of the litter just by appearance. We need to think about it a little more scientifically than that. So what I say is good litter, right, is one, it's got to be dry, right? I think we can all agree, right? Wet litter is not a good thing, all right? So we're going to talk about some principles of how we get to dry litter. Because if you start with wet litter, you're really starting behind the 8 ball, right? It's going to be an uphill battle. Okay, that litter needs to be free of pathogens, right? Baby chicks are having a very naive immune system. When you put them down on day one, they're not ready for disease, right? They're not ready to battle bacteria and viruses and stuff. So if we have pathogens in that litter already present, and of course they're going to peck it, they're going to eat at it, they're going to be ingesting those pathogens. So we need to make sure we don't have pathogens in the litter. And of course we have to get ammonia under control. So I think we can all agree those are three important criteria of good litter, right? If we have a lot of ammonia in the house, we're going to have some bird health issues. So how do we accomplish that? All right, and this is where the science part comes into it, right? I'm a scientist by training, by career. That's what I do. And so I like to over science kind of everything. My wife will tell you I overthink everything, but I like to say I over science it. And so in order to get dry litter, if we're going to get the moisture under control, we're going to have to think a little bit in terms of some physics. All right. We're going to have a little physics class today. All right. No equations, I promise. All right. If we're going to be free of pathogens, we're going to have to think in terms of some chemistry, and we're going to have to think in terms of some microbiology. We're going to think about bacteria, right? What do bacteria need? How do bacteria grow? We're going to apply a little microbiological science to the process. And if we're going to get ammonia under control, we need not only physics and microbiology and chemistry. We got to put them all together, all right? Because ammonia is actually quite a complicated thing. Otherwise, we'd have had it figured out a long time ago. All right, so let's talk a little physics. How do we get to dry litter? Let's apply a little physics to it. And really, litter moisture management starts the day the previous flock goes out, right? When they go to the processing plant, that's really when litter management needs to start, right? Litter management does not start 5 days before chicks come, all right? Litter management starts the day the other flock left, all right? That's when litter management really needs to be at the forefront of our thought process. And again, everyone's probably familiar with Mike Zarek down at the University of Georgia. I like to always bring in other people's information because, again, you guys then hopefully understand I'm not just saying things, right? There's actually a lot of other science behind what I'm putting out there. All right, and in this article, notice the title of their article was "Ammonia Control During Brooding Begins When the Previous Flock Ends." Right, that's when we got to start thinking about ammonia control and moisture management. All right, and again, the reason they say that in this article is because that caked litter will not dry out on its own, right? It is compressed, it is tightly compacted, and it's probably between 40 and 50% moisture. It's not going to dry out on its own. We have to physically go in there and do something about that caked out litter. Again, so what they're showing in this graph is that after 7 days, notice the moisture content has not changed. That moisture content, that caked litter is held in there. And consequently, the litter under that caked out litter is not going to dry out either because you've got this sealed surface on top that's preventing any water from evaporating. All right. So our number one priority when the birds leave is to determine how are we going to deal with this caked litter. All right. And so basically we're physically picking the water up and carrying it out of the house if we do cake removal. Okay. So again, we're all familiar with decake machines. They've been around for 50 years. I'm not telling you anything new. But again, it's about timing. It's about getting in there and doing that process as quickly as possible. And again, one of the advantages is once we remove that caked up surface, that seal, that crust on top, that allows the litter underneath to begin drying out, right? And the longer we have for that loose litter underneath that's going to stay to dry out, the more ahead of the game we're going to be. All right. So it's all about timing. It's about getting in there as quickly as possible. Now, if you thought that I was going to tell you today, you should decake, you should windrow, you should till, this is the order you should do those in, this is the preferred methodology, then I'm sorry, I'm sad you're going to be disappointed. Okay. Because I'm not going to tell you what you should or should not do on your farm, because what works on one farm might not work on another farm, or what works in this region might not work in another region. Okay. But I think we can all agree the goal is to get that litter as dry as possible. Okay. So what works on your farm is what you need to do. All right. But we have to keep the end goal in mind of getting that litter dry. Now, when I started working with Jones Hamilton last year, one of the first projects that I started was a project at Stephen F. Austin State University in East Texas to look at comparing windrowing versus not windrowing versus decaking, right? And now you might say, well, that's been done 20 years ago. That's not new. But sometimes we just need to take a new, fresh look at things, right? We sometimes get ourselves in a rut and in a groove, and it's good to always look at something from a new perspective. And so one of the things that we did in this uh, study during last summer was looked at, should we decake actually before windrowing? All right, some people like windrowing, some people don't. It's a personal choice. But one of the things that's most important about windrowing is thinking about, how are we going to manage that moisture? How are we going to get that moisture out of the house? Because if we keep all the cake in the house and we roll it into those piles, it can't evaporate out very well. Okay, so that's why downtime is so important during windrowing. And you guys have probably been told that for eons. You know that is true. So one of the things we did was we came in and just ran the decaker under the drinker lines prior to windrowing, and then came in and windrowed that litter up. And we were still very successful, right? I know a lot of people say, well, if you windrow, you have to keep the cake in because you need the moisture to drive the process. That's only true if you have really, really dry litter. All right. In this case, we had quite wet litter because the cool pads were running for most of the flock. It's hot in Texas most of the time. So we actually kind of started our moisture management process early, right? We didn't take all the cake out, but we just ran it under the drinker lines to get the most wet litter, right? The wettest part out. Then we rolled the windrows up. And we still got very, very good temperatures. Okay, you can see our temperatures again reached 140 or 150 degrees. And again, we all know, hopefully, that the target for windrowing, if you're going to do that process, needs to be at least 130 degrees, right? If you're not getting to 130 degrees, you're not really accomplishing a whole lot. So again, it's about making a decision, right? You have to look at how much moisture is in this entire litter mass, and should I keep it all in for the windrowing, or should I take some out before doing the windrow, right? This is where judgment comes in, and trial and error and practice comes into play. All right, so again, we windrowed the litter. We had a contractor come in and do the work for us. They did a really great job. And of course, one of the things that I do like about windrowing is where you have this wettest, darkest area here next to the cool pads, you've got a chance to dry that base out, right? We're exposing that pad to air. We're allowing it to dry out. And it also gives us an opportunity to, if we've had some microbial challenges, to maybe apply either some PLT or some other acid or some salt or something to that pad to help reduce that microbial load during that downtime. So there's also something there to keep in mind as well. And again, I'm not going to advocate for or against windrowing. You do with what works for you. The point is to start thinking about, how are you going to manage that moisture in that litter. And I will say, one of the things about windrowing that is very important is execution, right? If you're going to do it, you need to do a good job. You need to get all the litter away from the wall, out of the corners, get it all into the piles, and windrow it all the way down to the pad. All right. If you're only scraping the surface and kind of, getting close to the wall and not really getting in the corners, I don't know that you're accomplishing a whole lot. All right. So it's about the execution. And in this trial, I'll show you some more data at the end of the presentation. I think we did a really good job of windrowing the litter. And so if you do a good job, it can be successful. Now, again, I've been talking about moisture management. And unfortunately, I don't have a magic tool. I don't have a magic app on my phone that can, tell you, yes, this litter is dry. No, it's not. Okay. Unfortunately, we just don't have those kind of tools. So the best thing I can tell you to assess litter moisture is you got to get your hands a little dirty, right? And you get in there and you grab some of that litter. So I know the lighting, it's kind of hard to see the pictures, but in this picture, this litter looks nice and dry. Okay, it looks like it's ready to go, right? And if we grab a handful off the surface there and we use what I call the good old-fashioned squeeze method, right? You squeeze it, make a ball, and if you open your hand and that litter falls apart and doesn't maintain its shape, then that's pretty dry, right? It's in pretty good shape. So notice on the surface here, that litter is nice and dry and ready to go. But, all right, we're not only using the very, very top of the litter, right? We're using the entire litter mass. And that entire litter mass is what's going to absorb the moisture during the grow out. So we need to have that entire litter mass all the way to the bottom dry as well. So then what I did was, I think what's important is to look below the surface, right? So scratch the litter back a little bit, dig down an inch or two, all right? Get you a handful down there from the lower part of the litter bed, right? Squeeze that, and if you open your hand and notice, it's kind of hard to see in this picture, I understand. I still have a ball of litter, right? It still looks like a rock, okay? That's way too wet, all right? So while the surface of my litter, quote, looks good, it looks dry, the entire litter bed is not, right? And that's going to be my source of ammonia and bacteria and challenges and stuff throughout grow out, all right? So we need to make sure we're looking at the entire litter mass to determine, have we got the litter dry where we need it to be. Okay, so again, dry, not dry, okay? Pretty simple, all right? Not very scientific, but the best I can give you, all right? So I'll give you some more science now, though, all right? We'll get a little more scientific about it, all right? And the reason I'm harping on litter moisture is because it relates to this criteria, or this measurement we call water activity, okay? Water activity refers to the availability of water in a substance, okay? So when we make beef jerky, right, we dehydrate the meat, we suck all the water out of it, we get the water activity to be very, very low, and it can sit on the table and not spoil, right? It's shelf stable because the bacteria can't grow on it. There's no moisture available to those bacteria to grow and spoil that meat, okay? Kind of apply that same logic, if you will, to litter. So this is some research we did several years ago correlating litter moisture to water activity, or the amount of free water available in that litter material, okay? So water activity is measured on a scale from 0 to 1. 0 meaning no moisture, 1 meaning 100% of the bacteria, of the water that bacteria need, the water they need to access, is available to them, okay? Is freely available, all right? So typically when we talk microbiology, we want to have a water activity between about 0.9 and 1, all right? That's when bacteria are happy. They've got all the moisture that they need to grow. So notice in this regression line, all right, that correlates 0.9 to a water, or to a litter moisture of about 25%, okay? So people always ask me, well, what moisture should I be shooting for, okay? The simplest answer I can tell you is below 25%, right? Because that's going to decrease microbial activity potential in that litter, okay? I'd really love to say you get down here in the, 18, 19, 20% range, but below 25, okay? 25 is the maximum. If you're above 25, the bacteria have all the water they need, right? Okay? And if you get up to 30% moisture, which usually we start to see cake formation around 35% moisture, all right? So once you start to see cake formation, guess what? The bacteria have all the water they need, all the water they need to grow, all right? And so that's really getting into why moisture control is so, so important, because it's going to impact the potential growth of those bacteria in the litter that we're trying to control. Now, this is some other data, again, just kind of the same concept that we published several years ago from one of my graduate students' research. Notice this is litter moisture on the bottom here, all right, and we have, this is counts of E. coli in the litter, all right, and so this is in logarithmic numbers. So if you not familiar with logarithmic numbers, that just means 10 to the 1, 10 to the 2, 10 to the 3, all right. So this is 1,000, 10,000, 100,000. Log 6 is 1,000,000 bacteria per gram. So notice the red lines are regression. So typically, the more moisture you have, the more bacteria you have, right? The higher the moisture content, the more bacteria, okay? Clostridium perfringens, that one we really worry about because that's our causative agent of dermatitis, right? Notice again, a pretty good relationship. If we have more moisture, you're going to see more Clostridium in that litter. Now, the one that's really kind of has caught us off guard lately, I would say, is Enterococcus, right? And so we published this back in 2017, and the other scientist I was working with was interested in Enterococcus because Enterococcus is an indicator for fecal contamination in saltwater criteria. All right, but in marshes and things like that. But when we think about Enterococcus, it's been such a big disease challenge in broilers lately. Notice there is almost no relationship between moisture and Enterococcus counts. Enterococcus is very moisture resistant. All right, even if we dry the litter down to 20%, we still have very, very high Enterococcus loads. All right, and unfortunately, if you look back at E. coli and Clostridium, if we're down here at 20% moisture, notice our loads are down here in the 2 or 3 or 4 range. With Enterococcus, notice we're still up here in the 6s and 7s. Okay, again, remember 6 is 1 million bacteria per gram. So 7 is 10 million bacteria per gram. It's a lot of bacteria. And unfortunately, we can dry litter out and we're not going to get rid of Enterococcus. It's very, very environmentally stable, which is a little bit scary, right? So sorry to give you the bad news today. But we gotta think about these things when we're talking about litter management. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. I'm gonna come back to moisture and bacteria in a minute, but let's shift gears a little bit and think about ammonia because the two are related. All right, ammonia formation in the litter and volatilization. Volatilization means the ammonia coming out of the litter. All right, which is what we don't want. All right, are functions of moisture, temperature, and pH. Okay, those are our 3 criteria that really drive that ammonia process. Okay, we'll explain why. Okay, so pH, that's what our litter amendments do. All right, we apply an acid to the litter. We drive the pH down, right? If we get the pH below 7, we're going to sequester that ammonia as ammonium in the litter. Once we get above 7, once your litter amendment is utilized up, after a few days or a couple weeks, then we start to see ammonia coming out of the litter. All right, so that's what our litter amendments do. And everyone is familiar with that, I'm sure. But moisture and temperature management, that's what you guys do, right? I can help you with the pH, that's my job, but moisture and temperature management is all up to you because I'm not at your farm every day, so I can't do it for you. All right, so that's where you guys come into the equation. All right, now let's get a little more scientific-y without, putting you guys to sleep. All right, but where does ammonia come from in the litter? All right, it doesn't just actually magically appear, even though it feels like it. All right, ammonia comes from the breakdown of uric acid. Uric acid is the urinary excretion of chickens, right? Chickens don't produce urine like mammals, they produce uric acid. Okay, that uric acid gets broke down into ammonia. Okay, you can see the 4 ammonium molecules coming off of these equations here through this chemical pathway. All right, and I'm actually going to throw it out there and call this a biochemical pathway. Bio meaning living. All right, so notice that each step in this process, water has to be present. Right, that little arrow going into the equation means it's a cofactor. Without water, we don't get ammonia. Okay, thus again why I'm saying so much about moisture, moisture, moisture. Right, without moisture, without water, we don't have ammonia. It's very, very critical to this chemical process. The other part, the bio part, the living part that's really important is notice these green words, all right, each part of the process ending in ACE, A-S-E, meaning those are enzymes. Enzymes produced by the bacteria in the litter, okay? So without these enzymes, without bacteria, we don't have ammonia. All right, this is a biochemical process. So if we could sterilize the litter, if we could dry it out to 0% moisture, no ammonia. Okay, unfortunately, I can't tell you how to do that. All right, but we're going to get as close as we can. Right, we're going to try to decrease these as much as we can to lower the amount of ammonia as possible. Okay, and again, just to back up what I'm saying there, again, this is some data from the Poultry Science Journal. And so notice under the drinker lines here, our litter moisture is very, very high. And so notice our ammonia flux meaning the amount of ammonia coming out of the litter, emanating from the litter. They use that word flux. All right, notice it's much higher than the other areas where the moisture is much lower. Okay, so moisture drives this ammonia process. Okay, temperature is also very important, and I'll tell you, I wasn't even really aware of this phenomena until I came to work for Jones Hamilton, and I found this in some of our literature, and I was like, wow, that kind of makes a lot of sense. All right, and so what you look at this curve, and again, we know above 7, if our pH is going to be high, we're going to have ammonia volatilizing. Okay, notice there's 2 curves here. The one with the triangles is at 77 degrees, probably the typical temperature in our chicken houses, either towards the end of a flock or definitely during a downtime, right? When we're not running cool pads, we're not running heaters. Maybe today it might be 77 degrees if you have no chickens out in the house. And then there's another line with the boxes at 35 degrees. And you might say, well, that's ridiculous. We never have it 35 degrees in a chicken house. That's actually not true if you leave the doors open in wintertime, right? And I've seen this, right? I've seen it. I've been on farms and it's 37 degrees outside and cold and wet and rainy. All the doors are open, and you go in the chicken house and you shoot a thermometer on the litter, and what's the temperature of the litter? About 42 degrees, right? It's really, really cold. Okay. So what this principle is telling us is that when the litter is really cold, right? We're not keeping the houses closed up and we're letting that litter get too cold. It's actually suppressing that ammonia volatilization. All right. So during our downtime, we want to get as much ammonia out of that litter as possible. Thus, we want to keep that litter warm, right? If we allow that litter to get cold, it's actually going to sequester that ammonia inside. And then once we start heating the litter up, getting ready for chicks, guess what? Here it all comes, right? And it all flashes off at one time. So we want to make sure we try to always keep that litter as warm as possible, okay? So again, I've been on farms where the doors are wide open for 2 weeks, right? No one's going to close the doors. Very, very important to keep those doors closed and try to keep as much heat in that house as possible. Now, that doesn't mean we don't ventilate, right? We still got to get the ammonia and we got to get the moisture out of the house. So we've got to use some minimum ventilation, right? That doesn't mean lock all the fans on. It doesn't mean run fans 24 hours a day. It just means during the warmest and driest part of the day, when you can get the most moisture out of the house, we want to run a little bit of ventilation. All right. We want to close the doors up, but still run some fans and ventilate out and try to get as much moisture and as much ammonia out of that house during the downtime as possible. Okay. And of course, open doors are an invitation for other problems, right? John mentioned biosecurity a while ago. So we want to make sure we keep those doors closed for other important reasons. Okay, again, backing up that concept, right? Here's some more data from the Poultry Science Journal. So here is our litter temperature. Okay, so notice I put it in Fahrenheit for you. This is a difference of only 6 degrees. Okay, difference between 81 and 87 degrees litter temperature. All right. Notice our pH and our moisture are pretty similar, so those factors aren't different. So if we look at our ammonia flux, okay, the amount of ammonia coming out of that litter, notice it is significantly higher when the litter is warmer, right? So the warmer we can keep that litter, the more ammonia that we're going to get out of it during that downtime, okay? So that's what I'm trying to stress to you guys. And again, this is only a 6 degree difference, right? That's not a whole lot, but it does change the amount of flux rate from that litter during that downtime. Okay, so again, it's all about the physics, right? It's all about how do we get the moisture and the ammonia out of that litter during the downtime. And again, one of the things that we talk about a lot at Jones Hamilton is preheating. We've always said preheating is very, very important. And it goes back to these principles I've been talking about, right? Of evaporation of moisture. And we all know it takes heat to evaporate water, right? The more heat we can put to it, the more water we're going to evaporate. And of course, we would love to see, preheating for 72 hours, prior to chick placement. I realize that's tough, with gas prices and expenditures. I realize that's tough, but the point I'm making is the more preheat you can do on the front end, the better you're going to have once chicks go down, right? Because once chicks go down, it's really hard to deal with moisture and humidity and stuff like that, because we have to ventilate properly for the birds, and we can't just ventilate however we want. We have to ventilate for the birds. So the more we can do before the birds get there, the better off we're going to be in the long run. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about microbiology. That's kind of the thing that I really specialize in. I'm not a ventilation expert or a physicist by training. I do more microbiology. So again, just like the factors that impact ammonia volatilization, what factors impact bacterial survival? All right, and they're not very different. The only one we're going to throw in that's different is bacteria have to have nutrients. Okay, so unfortunately, in a chicken house, we're always going to have nutrients possible. So let's go back and talk about the Enterococcus thing. Okay, here comes more bad news. All right, all right. Enterococcus is part of the normal gut microflora of chickens, right? They just naturally have this bacteria in their intestines. There's not a whole lot we can do to change that. And it's kind of found everywhere in the environment, but it just like E. coli is everywhere in the environment and is a natural part of warm-blooded animals. Enterococcus, just like E. coli, is also an opportunistic pathogen, right? It's looking for a place to take over. It's looking for its niche where it can cause trouble. All right, and so it establishes itself early in the gut of the chicken, and then when it gets that opportunity, it moves to other parts of the body of the bird. All right, and so some of the literature that I've heard, and I actually attended a workshop out in California a couple of weeks ago that was a whole day long just about Enterococcus. They talked about Enterococcus for the whole day, all right, which was kind of boring by the end of it, but a lot of good information, all right. And really what happens is if you see a lot of early or even mid-flock grow out mortality, what's happening is this Enterococcus is moving from the gut to other parts of the bird and causing some of those other systemic infections, right? Pericarditis, so it's going to cause infection of the lining around the heart, right? That heart sac. It's going to cause liver lesions. Septicemia means we have free bacteria in the blood of the bird. So it's going to all kinds of places and causing all kinds of trouble. And of course, the one probably a lot of us have heard about then later on in the grow out cycle, maybe as far as 5 weeks of age, is that kinky back thing, right? Where it actually, that Enterococcus settles in the vertebrae of the bird and causes swelling in those vertebrae joints. That swelling of that vertebrae joint pinches the spinal cord of the bird, and guess what? They're paralyzed, right? They'll be sitting on their butts with their feet out in front of them, and they can't move because that Enterococcus has gotten in those joints of that vertebrae and caused that damage, right? And so now those birds can't walk, and if they can't walk and get the food and water, they eventually die, right? And so that's where we see some of that late mortality due to Enterococcus. Now, one thing I learned at that workshop in California a couple of weeks ago was that, again, going back to the research that we actually did back in 2017 and didn't even really think about it back then, was that Enterococcus is very, very hardy in the environment, right? So there was a really good paper in the Journal of Applied Microbiology back in 2020 in which they actually looked at the survivability of Enterococcus in litter at different humidities, all right, so different moisture content and different temperatures, okay? So thinking about different temperatures and humidity combinations. And they also looked at pathogenic versus non-pathogenic strains. Not all strains of Enterococcus are necessarily pathogenic, but some are, all right? So they have different genetics that control whether they cause disease or whether they don't. Interesting findings that I read in this paper I thought was very interesting. The pathogenic strains survive longer than the non-pathogenic strains in litter, okay, which is bad news, right? The ones that cause disease in the chickens actually survive in the litter better than the non-pathogenic ones. And lower temperatures typically result in longer survival times. So if we're keeping the litter too cold in the house, Enterococcus loves that, right? Because it's just going to sit there and it's not going anywhere, okay? So we can have really long downtimes and not be able to get rid of it. That's why sometimes I've heard a lot of people talk about the issue of Enterococcus on repeat farms, right? That it happens flock after flock after flock because it won't die out. It's very, very hardy. All right, so here's some of the data from that paper. Again, at 37 degrees C, which is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so human body temperature. So at pretty warm temperatures, notice this is interesting. This is very, very interesting. Regardless of humidity, regardless of moisture, Enterococcus will die off pretty fast in about 8 days. Okay, so if you can keep your chicken house almost 100 degrees for 8 days, you can get rid of Enterococcus. Who's going to be able to do that? All right, that's that. Texas, you can. I'm glad you said that, John, because you know what? You can. We actually had a company in South Texas last summer who was having some Enterococcus issues. They said, hey, can you come down and help us with this Enterococcus issue? We went down there and took samples. They had the houses closed up tight. It was, 102 degrees in South Texas all summer long, right? They had the houses closed up tight for 2 weeks. Went in there and sampled. Our Enterococcus counts were 1,500 grams, 1,500 CFU per gram. Almost nothing, okay? Because it was 100 degrees in the chicken house in South Texas in summertime, okay? But up here on the shore, I don't know that you guys are going to get that hot, okay? Unless you burn a lot of gas, okay? Where you guys are probably going to be, right, is in this 77 to 60 degree range, right, during your downtime. And guess what? Under really dry conditions, even if you got the litter super dry, you're keeping the air nice and dry in the house, you're ventilating, you got it down to 32% relative humidity, it's nice and cool in the house, guess what? It loves it. Enterococcus absolutely loves those conditions, all right? And it will hang around for 50 days or even outwards of 178 days at 60 degrees, okay? So that's the bad news, okay? So we really have to think about this microbial management in the litter. Once it gets seated in there, what are we going to do to get rid of it? And unfortunately, you can have even a long downtime and it's not going to go away. That's the bad news. Okay. So again, going back to my question, what influences microbial survival? Temperature is big. Okay. Moisture is big. Okay. Nutrients, we can't really change that. If there's chicken manure in the litter, they're going to have all the nutrients they need. And of course, then the other one is pH. So I want to spend the rest of the time talking about pH because that is one thing that we can manipulate. We can manipulate pH to a great deal. Okay. And again, this is another chart. You guys have maybe seen this in previous presentations. It's not new, right? This is from 1989. Alabama Cooperative Extension published this many years ago. And notice if we get the pH very low, we're down here in the 4 range, right? That slows down or even halts microbial activity, right? You guys are probably familiar with the process of turning cucumbers into pickles, right? What do you pour in the jar? What is the secret ingredient of making good pickles? Vinegar, right? What is vinegar? Vinegar is acetic acid, right? You're pouring acid in that jar to drive the pH down so the bacteria don't spoil those cucumbers, right? Same process we can do with the litter. We drive the pH down, we can reduce the survivability of those bacteria, okay? Again, more data from the Poultry Science Journal, right? This was 2007. At a very high pH, 7 or even alkaline at 9, and again, most chicken litter is going to be between 7 and 9. That's where it typically likes to fall. All right. Notice salmonella survived in this litter for upwards of 40 days. Okay. So even long downtime, we can't get rid of salmonella. all right, unless we drive the pH down. Notice if we go to a pH of 4, we change this scale from days to hours. Okay, within hours, we're driving those bacterial counts down because we're reducing that pH. Okay, I kind of call it the scorched earth mentality, right? We're creating an environment that those bacteria cannot handle. They can't take it. All right, it's too low of a pH. You're driving that pH down, and those bacteria are just going to die off because they can't survive. All right, so let's go back. Remember, I told you we were doing this big project at Stephen F. Austin University in East Texas, and we were looking at windrowing versus decake. And one of the things I was really interested in that study and looking at was the microbiology of it, right? Because I like microbiology. All right, so I know there's a lot of data, a lot of numbers on the chart, but I couldn't figure out a better way to display it. So I'll highlight the ones I want you guys to look at. So we're taking litter samples at the end of the flock. Day -1 would be 24 hours before chick placement, all right? And then at chick placement, all right? And so we have 2 houses that we windrowed on this farm, 2 houses that we just decaked, did not windrow. And we're comparing the 2 methodologies. So notice at the end of the flock, we've got some pretty high, no, I wouldn't call them high, but some moderate Clostridium counts, okay? So sorry, I should tell you what the abbreviations are. CP is Clostridium perfringens, right? Causes dermatitis. ENT is our Enterococcus counts, okay? So notice we've got some pretty high Clostridium counts there. After we windrow, those numbers go down. That's what windrowing was designed to do, right? Bud Malone was one of the guys who led the creation of windrowing here on the shore 20-something years ago, right? And they did it to combat dermatitis, okay? That's exactly what windrowing was designed to do. That's exactly what we're showing it does, right? It decreases the Clostridium perfringens counts, okay? If we didn't windrow, some of those Clostridia still were kind of hanging around, right? They didn't really die off on their own naturally. Clostridium is pretty hardy in the environment. But notice after we applied PLT, so we applied PLT before chick placement. And again, I'm saying PLT because that's what we produce. So that's the one we're going to use. We're not going to use the competitors' products. But notice if we drive that pH down, regardless of whether we windrowed or not, we're reducing those counts. We're driving those Clostridium counts down because we're getting the pH below 4. We're getting it where those bacteria cannot survive in that litter. Okay? And notice if we didn't windrow and we didn't use an acidifier of any kind, guess what? Those Clostridia are just hanging around. We haven't done anything to ruin their day, right? They're just hanging around, enjoying life because they've got a nice, beautiful chicken house in which to thrive and survive. Okay, let's look at Enterococcus, all right? Notice here again, our Enterococcus counts at the end of flock 1 are pretty high, again, up in that 6 or 7 even range. Lots and lots of bacteria in that litter. And then notice after we windrow, here's the other bad news. Man, I'm sorry I'm full of bad news today, guys, all right? But here's the other bad news. While windrowing is really good at getting rid of Clostridium, it's really good at getting rid of E. coli or Salmonella, all them other bacteria, for some reason, okay, that I can't explain, windrowing will not get rid of Enterococcus, okay? It does not touch it hardly one bit at all. So you can't windrow yourself out of Enterococcus, all right? That's the bad news. But what you can do, okay, and again, notice those counts are pretty much the same, whether it's decake or windrow, it doesn't matter. They're pretty much the same. What you can do is drive the pH down, right? We can drive the pH down, and we can greatly reduce those Enterococcus. Notice we go from about a 6.2 to a 3.2. So that's a 3-log reduction. That means we've reduced that bacterial count by 99.9%. We've gone from 1 million bacteria per gram to about 1,000 bacteria per gram. Okay, so we haven't eliminated them, but we've reduced that load very, very significantly, right? And when you think about it, that's important because when we put those chicks down, we want to have the best environment possible, right? We want to have the smallest pathogenic load to those chickens as we can on day 1 until they get that immune system going, until they get that gut microflora established, and hopefully then they can fend off, those bacteria on their own. Okay, let's look at the next flock. We got flock 2 going to flock 3. Again, we got some a little bit of Clostridium at the end of flock 2, not as much. But again, if we windrow that, we don't see any at all. Basically, these counts at the lab are 0. Okay, I put less than 10 because you can't say 0. The lower limit of detection when you're plating the samples is 10 bacteria. So if it's less than 10, basically the plate was 0. It's pretty close to 0. All right, so pretty close to 0 there after we windrowed. Notice we actually went up a little bit, surprisingly, with the decake. But then again, if we apply an acidifier, if we drive that pH down, it doesn't matter if we windrowed or if we decaked. Either way, we're driving that pH down and we're reducing those Clostridium counts. Okay, again, Enterococcus, again, we windrowed, didn't really touch them. Doesn't really do a whole lot to get rid of Enterococcus. But if we acidify the litter, again, we're getting that nice 2 log reduction of those bacterial counts. Now, one thing I'll say is this is an average number. Okay, if you look a little closer at these counts, because again, we were sampling along the wall, under the drinker line, and down the center of the house. Notice down the center of the house, we have pretty high pHs, very consistent across these houses. And you might be saying, well, why does PLT not work in the center of the house? That doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So I happened to be at the farm that day, right, when they were putting the PLT out. I snapped a picture of the truck spreading the PLT. And what do you guys notice? Looks to me like most of the PLT is getting applied out here, right? Kind of further out towards the wall under the drinker lines, which might not necessarily always be a bad thing. It could be that's typically if you decake, that's where your highest moisture is going to be. That's probably not a bad thing necessarily, but you're probably getting a little bit less PLT behind the truck. Okay, and so notice again, there's some pictures I took along the chain wall there. You can see how much was getting all the way to the outside, which is good. You want to get your acidifier all the way to the wall. You don't want to not do that. But I think what was happening is we were probably getting more like 150-pound rate in this area and only a 50-pound rate behind the truck, because we were supposed to be putting 100-pound rate across the whole house. Okay, so that, and if you look at your pH values, that's probably what we were getting, right? Notice our pHs along the wall or the drinker line are very, very low. When you're applying that higher rate, you're driving that pH down. When you have a low rate, only 50 pounds, maybe I'm guessing, I'm ballparking, right? You're getting it below 7. You're going to control ammonia, but you're not going to do a whole lot for bacteria because you're not getting it that low. Okay, so it really gives us the opportunity to look at just what we can accomplish with that higher rate of acidification. So sometimes when bad things happen, you can always, find the linings, right? Find the good part of it, right? And so notice our Enterococcus counts, like on the wall here, were almost 5 before we put out acidifier. After we put out acidifier at a very, very high rate along that wall, we didn't detect any, right? So the higher the rate, the better the bacterial kill that we're going to see because we're driving that pH very, very low. Okay, so I know I've probably taken up too much of you guys' time. So to summarize here, again, a lot of science behind what we need to be thinking about when it comes to litter management, right? Litter management starts the day the other flock went out. We got to start dealing with that moisture right away as quick as possible. Keep the houses closed up during downtime. Do some minimum ventilation to get that moisture and ammonia out of the houses, and preheat as much as you can, right? If it's 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours would be wonderful. I understand gas is expensive, but the more you can preheat, the more you're going to dry that litter out, the more you're going to be able to maintain moisture control into the grow out. All right. And of course, the bad news is you can't windrow yourself out of Enterococcus. So if you've got Enterococcus, we got to think of something else, right? We've either got to do some scorched earth with some acid, or we got to do a clean out, or we got to do something, right? And of course, the lower the litter pH we can get, if we can get it below 4, that's going to be very beneficial from a microbiological standpoint. Okay, and of course, the lower we can get that starting pH before chicks arrive, the longer it's going to last into the grow out, and the better we're going to be able to hopefully suppress those pathogens in that litter. Okay, and I'll give you a smile, a frowning face there on that one because that one's kind of sad, right? That one kind of makes me sad. Okay, so again, I appreciate your time today, and hopefully it was useful to you.
Again, we want to thank you for sponsoring lunch. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
How do you measure pH in the litter?
How do you measure pH? Very, very simple. You get you a little portable pH meter. They're little handheld units. I don't know what they cost. They're not very expensive, like $100 probably or something. You get you a handful of litter. You put it in a plastic cup or a baggie. You pour in some distilled water that you can buy at the grocery store. You mix it up. You stick the pH meter in there. Gives you a number. It takes 5 minutes.
You ever do a scorcher spray with vinegar all over the floor?
Vinegar? I would say I've never tried it. I would say that would be probably very tough because vinegar, one, when you quantify the strength of acids, vinegar is a weak acid, right? And so it's not going to have the pH lowering capacity that a strong acid will. And so you want to use a strong acid, like sulfuric acid or hydrochloric acid or something that's very, very powerful acid to lower that pH. Vinegar it'll give you some pH reduction, but I don't think it's going to get you to where you want to be.
Probably expensive too.
Yeah, I don't have any idea what the cost would be. And of course, the other benefit then, or other problem is you got. I guess it would depend on the concentration of the vinegar, right? If you're only talking like 5% vinegar, like we use for canning pickles, 5% is almost nothing, right? You're going to have to get some 30 or 40% vinegar, solution to really, really have enough acid to actually make a difference. Yes, sir.
Once the moisture in the air or in the litter make the cake.
I'm sorry?
The moisture in the air or in the litter make the cake.
Make the cake?
Mm-hmm.
Well, really both, right? So, that goes back to the principle of ventilation, right? What is the most important job of ventilation in a chicken house? Moisture control, right? Ventilation is not about temperature control. It's about moisture control, right? You want to ventilate.
Ideal digit, you're going to follow down so you won't have a cake.
So what's the ideal or moisture in the air?
Any moisture, any moisture digit, we don't get the cake.
Right. So you want to maintain you don't want to get it, super dry because that's going to dehydrate your chicks. So you want to keep your humidity between about 50 and 60% in a poultry house. Okay. What that allows you to do then, that 40 or 50% that's not saturated in the air, that's where your moisture from the litter can evaporate into the air. Okay. So if you've got high humidity in the chicken house, if you've got 70, 80, 90% humidity, the moisture in the litter has got nowhere to go, right? So the only way to dry the litter out is to evaporate that moisture into the air. So humidity control is what's going to control the caking of the litter.
When you start making the cake?
When does it start making cake? About 30 to 35% moisture is when you're going to start to see cake formation in the litter. Yes, about 30 to 35%. So if you start seeing cake forming, you got too much moisture. You got too much humidity. You got too much moisture. You got to start drying things out. Yes, sir.
Rick, could you say, how do you manage that moisture? Is it simple as saying sun up, fan on, sun down, fan off?
Sure. Yeah. As long as it's not raining, right? There's no point in ventilating. And it goes back to relative humidity, right? The humidity outside is always going to be, you're exactly right. It's very, very high at night. So there's not a lot of, during downtime, if it's 100% humidity outside and you're pulling air through there, you're not going to accomplish a whole lot, right? Because there's nowhere for the moisture to go. That's why, like you said, very simple, ventilate during the daylight hours during downtime because the humidity is going to be less when the sun is up. You can pull moisture out of the house. So you're exactly as I'm saying. Don't run fans 24 hours a day because you're not going to accomplish anything at night. When it's 95% humidity outside, you're not going to get any evaporation of that moisture out of the litter. So ventilate when the humidity is lowest outside. Again, we're talking about downtime. We're talking about when there's no chickens in the house, you know. Yes, all year long. Keep the doors closed and use your fans during the daytime to ventilate out the moisture and the humidity. Right. Yeah. And again, because you've got air inlets, right? Your chicken house is designed with inlets or cool pad openings to allow the air to come in. So utilize those. You don't need to have the doors open to get air into the house if you're using your fans with your inlets. So yeah, because you want to conserve that heat, right? And it's really important because the warmer that litter is during the downtime, the less gas you have to spend to heat it back up when you get ready to brood chicks, right? When you start preheating, it's going to take less gas to heat it up if you conserve the heat in that litter by keeping the barn closed up.
Any other questions?
Layer time. What is the ideal layer time between the flock? According to the
You mean downtime, your out time? I mean, I don't know if there's a quote ideal. I mean, obviously, the old quoted number is 14 days, right? We love to have minimum 14 days. If you can have 21, that's even great, because it gives you that time, right? This ability to dry the litter out, it's a time thing, right? And that's why sometimes when markets are what they are and we have short downtimes, you get 9, 10, 11 days. That next flock is always a challenge, right? Because you don't have enough downtime to dry that litter out. So the longer the downtime, the better. Obviously, you don't make any money when chickens are not present. So we don't want to say 30 days because you're not making any money. But 14 to 21 days is kind of that magic window of when you can still make some money, but hopefully have enough time to get that litter dried out.
Or you think downtime starts after you've done what you're going to do to the litter, not when the live haul truck leaves, but when you go in, you windrow, you decay, when you're done, that starts your downtime? Because then it's truly resting.
Right. Well, yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, because during that time of quote managing the litter, right, when you're tilling, you're decaking, you're windrowing, whatever it is, you're not really getting any moisture loss during that time. So right, your quote moisture loss, your moisture evaporation downtime, that ventilation period is really, yeah, once you've finished doing whatever litter management process you're going to do before, between that time and when chicks show up, and that's why with windrowing, your total downtime is so critical, right? Because your downtime between leveling those windrows and when chicks show up is that critical drying period, right? And so, that's why we often say with windrowing, if you don't have at least a 14-day downtime, you shouldn't windrow because you're not going to have enough time between leveling those piles and when chicks show up to get that moisture evaporation process going.
Why do you have more ammonia when you windrow?
Why do you have more ammonia when you're windrow? That's a great question, and it goes back to that chart, that biochemical process I showed you guys, right? Windrowing is a microbial process, right? You're piling that litter up, and what it's doing, really, it's the same process that's going on if the litter wasn't piled up. You've got bacteria in there creating ammonia through that biochemical process. But the problem is when you put it into the pile, you're trapping the heat, right? You're trapping the heat. It's heating up. And so you're actually accelerating that microbial process. And by accelerating that microbial process, you're accelerating that ammonia generation, that biochemical pathway that's generating that ammonia. And that's why you get more ammonia with windrow, because you're speeding up that microbial process due to creating the perfect environment for those bacteria to thrive. Which is a good and bad thing, right? It's good that we can then kill off pathogens, but it's bad that now we've got this ammonia challenge, right? And so that's why you got to have ample ventilation, ample downtime once you level those windrows to get that ammonia out of the house and the moisture.
So what's your thought on total washdown?
A total washdown? Like wild, I would say that would always depend on how much litter moisture you have at the end of the flock. If you've got wet litter and you go in there and put more water on top of it, you're compounding your problems, right? Sure, because you can ventilate more in the summertime. So yeah, so if you want to do your wash down in the summertime and you've already got a dry litter bed to start with, then there's probably no problem in doing that. But yeah, in wintertime, when you've already got moisture challenges, you're adding more water to it, it's cold outside, you don't have heat to help get the moisture out, that would scare me. That would be challenging. Yes, ma'am. Yep. You know, again, windrowing is it's a personal decision, right? And it depends on your management style and your ability and the equipment or that you have available, right? If I think windrowing can be successful year round if you have one, ample downtime, and two, you have not excessive litter moisture, right? And so if you're going to windrow year round, you know, particularly in wintertime, you might, again, go back to those early slides I was talking about where you may need to do some decake to get some of that moisture out before you put it into the windrows, right? And of course, I would say the reverse of what you said is exactly the thing that I would never do, right? Not windrow in summer and then windrow in winter, because that's looking for trouble, right? That's, you know, so again, it's a personal flock by flock decision, and it depends on your microbial challenge, right? If you don't have a real microbial challenge, then what are you gaining from windrowing? Right? Windrowing is designed to kill bacteria, it's designed to kill E. coli, designed to kill Clostridium. If you don't have those problems, then why are you windrowing? What are you accomplishing? You're not going to kill Enterococcus. I can kind of tell you that, right? So it's a personal decision, you know. And again, what works well for you might not work good for him, right? It's a personal decision, and I'm not going to tell you you should or should not do it, and I'm not going to tell you you should or should not do it in the summer versus the winter. It's a personal decision based on microbial challenge, based on moisture management.